Intense fighting between the Syrian army and Kurdish-led forces in the city of Aleppo has forced tens of thousands of people to flee.
Early in the night, the sky over Syria appeared calm, with no warnings, no public alerts, and no visible signs that violence was about to return. Within minutes, that silence was torn apart as aircraft lifted off. Combat radars switched into active modes, and brief, coded communications moved quickly across military channels. These were not the chaotic signals of a sudden clash, but the familiar patterns of a modern operation unfolding exactly as planned. Multiple movements in the air and on the ground pointed to coordination rather than reaction, suggesting that this was not a single strike, but a controlled wave designed to send a message. What followed was not an emotional response, but a military signal prepared in advance, delivered with precision and intent. Its background opened with tension because American planners were still absorbing the impact of a previous ambush that left Americans dead and trust shattered across multiple commands. That earlier attack shaped every decision, since it showed that the threat had crossed from distant nuisance into direct danger for people in uniform and civilians nearby. Silence followed publicly. Yet behind closed doors, the pressure increased, measured in patrol reports, intercepted movements, and warning signs that refused to fade. Every quiet hour deepened the sense that waiting carried its own cost, and that cost was being counted carefully by senior leaders nationwide. ISIS had not disappeared after years of pressure, but it had learned how to move quietly, reshaping itself into smaller cells that blended into broken spaces. These groups avoided mass gatherings, refrained from speeches, and avoided signals that had once made them easy to track. Instead, they relied on patience, local networks, and knowledge of terrain that outsiders rarely understand. The threat became slower, colder, and harder to spot, yet no less lethal. American intelligence saw this shift clearly and warned that restraint alone would invite repetition. The danger was evolving, not fading. The margin for error was shrinking rapidly, daily. Washington faced two clear paths as pressure mounted, each carrying risk and consequence beyond the battlefield itself. One option was held in reserve at a low level, preserving calm while hoping deterrence would be effective. The other option raised the threshold deliberately, signaling that red lines mattered and violations would draw real costs. Delay favored the enemy, while escalation carried political weight at home and abroad. Commanders understood that inaction could be read as weakness by groups trained to test limits. Balance became impossible to maintain. The choice narrowed with every passing hour, and pressure did not ease. Inside secure rooms, across agencies, the timing of the strike mattered because conditions aligned in a narrow window that would not stay open long. Targets had revealed patterns through movement, communication, and supply habits that rarely repeat. Partner forces were positioned and ready, with weather and visibility conditions supporting rapid action. Waiting risked losing clarity and momentum built over weeks of quiet tracking. Yesterday became the right moment, not by chance, but by calculation. The message needed to be delivered before the network could scatter again. Every delay increased escape routes. That urgency drove the decision. At the highest level, with full awareness of consequences and shared responsibility. When action began, it unfolded across several areas at once, denying targets the comfort of focus or prediction. Aircraft moved in coordinated paths, while partner units prepared on the ground with clear roles. The design aimed to overwhelm decision-making rather than structures, cutting response time to seconds. Sound, light, and sudden movement replaced warning and negotiation. Targets faced pressure from multiple directions, forcing isolation and confusion. No single location carried the weight of the strike. Instead, the effect came from simultaneity. Control depended on speed and discipline. Every movement was timed, every delay removed. Room for resistance. At once, Coordination defined the operation, with American air power working alongside partner forces trained for rapid follow-through. Pilots focused on precision points, while ground elements secured perimeters and channels. Information flowed continuously, linking sensors, aircraft, and teams without pause. This cooperation reduced the risk of overlap and error in tight windows. Each unit understood the whole picture enough to act independently if needed. Trust replaced hesitation during key moments. Partner forces sealed routes and gathered material, while air cover held overhead. This balance prevented collapse and prevented escape under intense pressure across multiple zones. At the same time, without warning, signals. Targets were chosen for function rather than symbolism, focusing on command nodes, storage points, and movement links. Command centers lost connectivity as equipment was disabled, forcing operators to react unthinkingly. Weapons caches were hit to reduce future threats rather than to create a spectacle. Supply routes suffered interruption as vehicles and paths were cut off in sequence. Each strike removed an option, narrowing choices for those under pressure. The aim was to slow and fragment capability. Damage was measured and deliberate, not excessive, enough to change behavior, overcoming days across the region without mass destruction or civilian harm. Focused. Speed replaced brute force as the defining feature, with timing valued above raw explosive weight. Aircraft arrived and departed quickly, reducing exposure and limiting the chance of counteraction. Precision strikes demanded accurate intelligence and disciplined execution. There was no effort to dominate the skyline or broadcast power. The message came through clearly, rather than being lost in noise. Targets were engaged, confirmed, and cleared in short cycles. Momentum prevented regrouping. Each minute mattered, each second compressed decisions. Pressure stayed constant until objectives were met and the operation closed, with a minimal footprint on the ground, leaving uncertainty behind for adversaries and clarity for planners. Forward. Throughout the operation, one idea guided restraint and resolve, that crossing a red line brings consequences beyond symbols. This belief shaped pacing, target choice, and follow-through. When a group tests limits, the response shifts from message to action. Symbolic gestures no longer suffice once lives are lost. This moment marked that transition clearly. Pressure was applied where it mattered most. Not for the theater, but for deterrence, and to reset boundaries. This clarity defined the night. It was deliberate, it was controlled, and it was intended to be noticed by every observer, watching quietly from afar without announcements or debate. As the actions unfolded, observers who follow these silent fronts understood the value of attention and continued awareness. These battles rarely dominate headlines, yet they steadily shape security outcomes. Readers tracking such operations often look for signals rather than spectacle. If you are following these quiet theaters of force, take a moment to subscribe to military power. Staying informed helps place each movement in context. Understanding patterns matters, especially when cameras avoid violence and decisions unfold without speeches. This awareness builds perspective over time, across conflicts and across borders, where outcomes ripple into daily life without warning or delay at scale. As this phase closed, the field was left altered, with networks disrupted and expectations reset for what was to follow. Silence returned briefly, but it carried weight and anticipation. And those watching knew the consequences would extend beyond the immediate strikes. Ground reactions, political signals, and adaptive responses were already forming. This opening phase set conditions rather than conclusions. What comes next depends on how pressure reshapes behavior. The following section turns to the aftermath and emerging patterns. It examines response and adjustment, across actors involved without rushing judgment, but following effects step by step as momentum shifts into a new phase. Now, this phase of the operation revealed a form of warfare that does not seek ground, flags, or visible victory, but instead targets an organization's ability to exist as a system. No territory was taken, no front lines were drawn, and no announcements followed the strikes, because the purpose was not control of space, but removal of function. Every action focused on how the network thought, moved, and survived, treating it less like an army and more like a criminal structure that depends on coordination. This approach reflected a modern doctrine that measures success by the silence that follows rather than the damage caused at the moment of impact. The absence of mass movement on the ground was itself a signal of intent. Surveillance formed the outer layer of this doctrine, operating continuously before and during the operation, shaping every decision without ever becoming visible. Aircraft and remote platforms watched patterns rather than individuals, tracking how routes overlapped, how pauses aligned, and how signals appeared and disappeared across terrain. These observations identified behavior consistent with organized networks, where redundancy replaces strength and movement replaces defense. Each piece of information narrowed uncertainty, allowing action without exposure. Control came from seeing without being seen. Target data then moved to the center of the process, transforming raw observation into usable direction. Locations were not selected for size or symbolism, but for their role inside the system, serving as points where planning, storage, and movement converged. Digital mapping and time-based analysis reduced errors, ensuring that action was taken only where a function existed. This precision limited collateral risk while maximizing effect. The network was treated as a structure to be dismantled piece by piece. Precision airstrikes represented the visible edge of this method, but their importance lay in timing rather than force. Weapons were selected to collapse rooms, shut off equipment, and sever connections, rather than demolish entire blocks. Each strike aligned with others, preventing adaptation or escape. The result was fragmentation, as cells lost guidance and resources simultaneously. Destruction was limited, but disruption was complete. Ground forces were deliberately kept at a distance, not because of weakness, but because their presence would have altered the nature of the operation. Entering contested areas would have shifted focus toward control and defense, drawing attention and increasing risk. By avoiding the immediate deployment of infantry, planners preserved flexibility and reduced exposure. Pressure was applied without occupation, denying targets the chance to rally or frame resistance. Absence became part of the message. This method reflects a broader shift in how power is applied, where speed and data replace numbers, and denial replaces dominance. Organized threats that operate like networks are confronted with responses designed to disrupt their rhythm rather than overwhelm them. The operation demonstrated how control can be achieved through coordination rather than concentration. Each action reinforced the others, forming a closed loop of pressure. The network faced collapse without ever seeing the full force applied against it. Beyond the battlefield, reactions spread quickly through regional partners who understood the meaning behind the timing and restraint. Support was expressed through quiet alignment rather than public statements, signaling approval without escalation. Coordination channels remained active, indicating readiness to adapt if conditions changed. This response reflected confidence in the method rather than surprise at the outcome. Stability was reinforced through shared understanding. Other armed groups, watching from a distance, adjusted their behavior almost immediately, reducing movement and limiting communication. The speed of the strike and its focus on function sent a clear signal that adaptation alone does not guarantee safety. Observers recognized that visibility increases vulnerability in this environment. Silence became a form of defense. The ripple effect extended beyond the immediate target. For the primary target, the message was unmistakable, delivered not through words, but through the absence of control. Leadership links were severed, resources immobilized, and confidence disrupted. Recovery would require time, trust, and visibility, all of which now carried risk. The organization was reminded that thresholds exist, and crossing them brings consequences that are measured and precise. Deterrence was reinforced through demonstration. Other extremist groups received the same warning, even if they were not explicitly named or directly engaged. The method showed that waiting does not weaken response, and that patience can precede decisive action. Observation alone does not protect against intervention when patterns become clear. The environment had changed, and adaptation now carried new costs. This understanding reshaped calculation across multiple networks. This strike was not designed to end conflict, but to redefine it, shifting emphasis from presence to capability. It showed how power can be applied without spectacle, and how control can be asserted without occupation. The psychological impact extended beyond immediate damage, altering expectations and behavior. In modern conflict, perception matters as much as force. One strike does not end a war, but it reshapes the mental landscape in which future choices are made. By targeting the organization rather than the territory, the operation narrowed options for those who rely on concealment and coordination. The battlefield expanded beyond geography into decision-making itself. Pressure now exists where certainty once stood. A strike like this does more than remove assets because it forces every observer to question what can still be hidden, which is the psychological ground explored in the next section. The strike raised a serious military question because it revealed how the United States now applies pressure in the Middle East without stepping into open war. Every action during the operation pointed to a strategy built on control rather than occupation, where force is used to shape behavior rather than seize territory. Aircraft movements, target selection, and timing all indicate that Washington is no longer pursuing symbolic victories, but rather focusing on disrupting the ability of hostile networks to function. This approach treats armed groups less like armies and more like organized criminal systems that rely on coordination, trust, and a flow of resources. Once those elements are damaged, power collapses without the need for prolonged fighting. From a military perspective, the operation demonstrated that U.S. strategy in the region has shifted towards sustained pressure instead of decisive battles. Surveillance remained active before, during, and after the strike, showing that action was part of a wider sequence rather than a single event. The use of precision strikes against functional nodes revealed a preference for dismantling systems instead of eliminating fighters one by one. This method reduces the likelihood of rapid recovery while avoiding the political costs associated with large deployments. It also allows the United States to remain present without appearing dominant on the ground. The question of whether ISIS can recover depends less on the workforce and more on the structure. Fighters can be replaced, but coordination is more complex to rebuild when constantly observed. The strike targeted leadership connections, storage capacity, and movement routes, which are the foundations of any organized network. Without reliable communication and supply, cells lose direction and begin acting independently. That fragmentation weakens planning and increases mistakes, which further exposes the group to detection. Recovery becomes slow and uncertain under these conditions. Every movement after the strike suggested that the network understood the extent of the damage. Patterns shifted, activity slowed, and caution replaced confidence. This behavior mirrors what happens to criminal groups after a significant arrest, where fear and distrust spread internally. Leadership becomes isolated, and lower-level members hesitate to act without guidance. Even if ideology remains, the ability to act decisively fades. The strike, therefore, targeted capability rather than belief. Control of escalation was a central feature of the operation. The United States avoided actions that would force a direct response from state actors or draw regional forces into open conflict. By relying on air power, intelligence, and partners, Washington maintained distance while still applying pressure. This balance allowed force to be used without creating a visible front line. It also reduced the risk of miscalculation that often leads to larger wars. Avoiding large ground deployments was not a sign of restraint alone, but rather a method of controlling escalation. Ground forces create friction, exposure, and political cost that can spiral quickly. By keeping operations remote and precise, the United States preserved flexibility. Pressure could increase or decrease without dramatic shifts in posture. This approach keeps adversaries uncertain about the next move, which limits their willingness to escalate. The boundary between counterterrorism and regional conflict remains thin, and this strike highlighted how carefully it is managed. Actions were designed to stay below the threshold that would trigger a broader response. Targets were chosen for military value rather than symbolic impact. Timing was calculated to avoid moments of heightened regional tension. These choices demonstrate that escalation is being actively managed rather than reactively. At the same time, the operation sent a clear message that limits exist. Organized violence operating under the assumption of patience and invisibility faces consequences. The strike showed that distance and dispersion no longer guarantee safety. Data and coordination enable the force to operate effectively even when physical presence is not required. This reality forces hostile groups to reconsider long-term strategies. The broader implication is that modern conflict increasingly resembles a contest of systems instead of armies. Victory comes from disrupting processes rather than holding territory. Surveillance, data fusion, and precision replace mass and movement. This shift favors actors with technological depth and disciplined coordination. It also shortens the gap between action and effect. For the region, the strike reinforced a pattern of controlled pressure that avoids dramatic escalation. Allies observed the method and adjusted expectations accordingly. Adversaries recognize that provocation does not force predictable responses. This unpredictability strengthens deterrence without provoking confrontation. Stability is maintained through uncertainty rather than dominance. The operation did not end the threat, but it reshaped the environment in which the danger operates. Space to maneuver narrowed, time to plan shortened, and trust inside the network weakened. These effects accumulate over time, gradually reducing influence. This slow erosion aligns with a strategy focused on endurance rather than resolution. Conflict becomes managed rather than concluded. From a military analysis standpoint, this moment can be viewed as a turning point in the application of force. Not because it changed the balance overnight, but because it confirmed a method that blends pressure with restraint. The United States demonstrated that it can strike decisively while still avoiding the traps of occupation and escalation. This balance defines modern power projection. Whether this action is sufficient or only an opening step depends on what follows. Sustained pressure must be maintained to prevent recovery. Intelligence must continue to adapt as networks adjust. Partners must remain aligned to preserve control. Without these elements, gains fade. The strike demonstrated that modern warfare prioritizes organization over ideology. It also showed that escalation can be controlled through discipline and design. The conflict now moves forward under new conditions shaped by this action. What comes next will determine whether this moment stands as a decisive shift or the beginning of a longer campaign explored in the next section. According to you, was this action strong enough, or was it only the opening move? The events that unfolded make one thing clear. This was not a full-scale war, but it was no longer a symbolic response meant only to send a warning. The strikes avoided mass mobilization and public spectacle, yet they carried real weight because they targeted how ISIS functions, moves, and survives. This was not about chasing headlines or delivering emotional reactions. It was about pressure applied at specific points where structure matters more than faces. In modern conflict, survival depends on systems, and those systems are deliberately placed under stress. ISIS was not defeated solely through the removal of individuals, but through damage to its coordination, supply, and command. which allowed the organization to regenerate. Groups like this adapt quickly when only fighters are lost, because replacements are easier to find than rebuilt networks. By focusing on logistics, control nodes, and movement routes, the operation aimed to slow the group's ability to plan and act in the near future. This approach reflects an understanding that modern extremist groups function like fragmented enterprises rather than classic armies. Breaking the structure weakens the entire body, even if the name persists. For the United States, the operation carried a broader significance beyond the battlefield itself, as it demonstrated that speed and decisiveness remain viable tools. There was no long buildup, no extended public debate, and no delay that allowed targets to disperse. Action occurred when conditions aligned, and it was characterized by coordination rather than chaos. This matters in regions where hostile actors often test hesitation. The message was simple but firm. Red lines are monitored, and crossing them triggers practical consequences, not just ceremonial ones. At the same time, this operation did not claim to end the conflict, nor did it pretend to deliver a final resolution. Pressure can disrupt, but it cannot erase ideology or remove instability overnight. What it can do is reset calculations on the other side, forcing groups to shift resources from planning attacks to surviving disruption. This buys time and space, both for local partners and for wider regional stability. The absence of celebration or declaration reflected realism, as those involved understood that this struggle moves in cycles, rather than having an outcome. The larger context remains unsettled, with fragile borders, fractured governance, and armed groups waiting for opportunity. Actions like this shape behavior quietly, pushing conflict into less visible forms rather than dramatic clashes. That shift can reduce immediate harm, but it can also make threats more difficult to identify and track. Modern warfare often operates below the surface, where outcomes emerge gradually rather than through a single decisive moment. This reality defines the current phase of the fight, one marked by precision, restraint, and constant monitoring. For viewers who follow these developments, understanding this pattern is more important than tracking individual strikes. Each action is a piece of a longer contest over control, influence, and deterrence. The absence of significant battles does not mean the absence of danger. It means the battlefield has changed shape, moving into shadows where intelligence, timing, and coordination decide outcomes. This is where modern power is most often put to the test. Subscribe to Military Power to continue following the invisible fronts of modern warfare, where decisions are made quietly and consequences unfold over time. And as this chapter closes, one question remains for everyone watching these shifts closely. Do strikes like these help keep the Middle East stable, or do they push conflict into a more dangerous and unpredictable form?